Suicide is a taboo topic, but today on Ministry in Motion, we're going to talk about it. Why? Because it's too big to ignore. Globally, 800,000 people commit suicide every year. Every 2 seconds, someone, somewhere on the planet, attempts to commit suicide. People who are suicidal can be helped, and we're going to discover how with psychiatrist Dr. Torben Bergland, who is the Associate Director of Adventist Health Ministries at the General Conference. You're watching Ministry in Motion, where we explore best practices for your ministry in the 21st century. Torben, why do we need to talk about suicide?
Well, unfortunately, suicide is a reality that many people struggle with, and around the world it's a major issue. Also, the estimates are that about 800,000 people every year commit suicide.
800,000?
800,000 people commit suicide. That's about one person every 42nd.
Wow.
So, and we also estimate, like, it's difficult to know how many suicide attempts there are annually, but our estimates are that sort of approximately for every suicide there are 20 to 30 suicide attempts. So that means every second approximately someone around the world is trying to kill themselves. And it's so tragic.
Tragic, frightening and disturbing. It's so many things, isn't it?
Yes. I think it's very important, because it is frightening. It goes to, it triggers some very fundamental fears in us, that it would be the most convenient and comfortable we see to just to ignore it. But this is a reality for many people. And as a psychiatrist, when I've been working, I always ask my patients, do you have any thoughts of suicide? Have you had thoughts of suicide? Have you ever tried to commit suicide? It's like if I would not ask those questions, I would not be doing my job. And my experience with patients have been, it's the exception that my patients say, no, I've never had any thoughts about suicide.
It's the exception.
It's the exception. It's rare. When that happens, I'm sort of surprised, because it's so rare that a patient who is struggling mentally, it doesn't have to be a severe mental illness, but like depression, anxiety, that kind of issues, most patients, I just take it as a given that they are struggling or have struggled with thoughts about suicide, ending life at some point.
Now, is it more prevalent amongst men or women? And is there a certain age group where it's particularly manifest?
Well, it's a bit like a complex picture, because suicides are more common among men than women, but more women than men make suicide attempts.
Okay.
So it seems like when men make a suicide attempt, they often use more radical and drastic means that with more lethal outcomes. Women may have, if we could say so, sometimes softer methods, they can be overdose, intoxication, that kind of things. Men may use guns, hang themselves, that kind of things. So in many places we see that the rate among men is about twice of suicides than compared to women, roughly. But then significantly more women make suicide attempts than men, but not as often with lethal outcomes. So it's a major issue.
Yeah.
And fortunately, over the last years globally, we have seen that the number of people who commit suicide is quite stable, even though the population is increasing. the number of around 800,000 is stable. And that's because some of the big countries like India and China, then suicide rates among women has decreased significantly. And we
that's
think,
good news.
Yes, that's good news. That's good news, and we think that that's related to that the status of women has been improved, the way they're respected, cared for in society, it has improved. So of course these are big countries with huge populations. So when you see a significant drop in these countries, then that affects the overall. But like disturbingly, what we see in the US, the rates of suicide the last 20 years has increased by 30%.
That is tragic.
That is tragic. So and that's to some extent is the US is to some extent an outlier globally in this, but it's really disturbing again because like what's going on in the US society, and we know sometimes like the US goes like are in the front, and then other countries the same trends develop in other countries later, just with some delay.
Yeah.
So that is very disturbing, and like suicide sort of it's basically all ages. But among young people, suicide is the leading cause of death.
The leading?
Not the leading, but often a leading.
Okay.
For some categories, it's the second cause of death.
Second
among
largest,
yes. That accident is the leading cause, but then that suicide is the number 2 cause of death. Right. And that's so tragic. Young people, teenagers, 20s, young adults, that sort of decide to end life.
Yeah. Now you've mentioned the global nature of this, the United States. I know tragically from my home country of Australia, it occurs there. Yes. And you talked about China and India. Recently I was having a conversation with a pastoral colleague, and he said suicide rarely happens in Africa, sub-Sahara Africa. Okay. What's your feeling on this?
Well, I was in Africa a few weeks ago and did some talks on mental health, and I was amazed by hearing the stories about the number of suicides that people just in that group were familiar with. So I can't quote the statistics for Africa, but when I looked into this recently, then there is significant numbers also in Africa and most countries. So it's a significant issue. So it may be less than compared to some other countries. Some countries are very high.
But it's still there.
It's significant. It's definitely significant, and it should be on our radar wherever we are when we are dealing with people.
So what's the link between suicide and mental health? There's clearly a link.
There is a link, yes, definitely. Again, sort of, it's difficult sometimes to sort of, you have a suicide and then you look back at the history, sort of what happened. Did this person struggle with some mental health issue? In many cases, we estimate like that at least half of all cases of suicide, then there is probably some kind of mental illness. It may have been undetected, unrecognized, and also by the individual may not have recognized that they're actually struggling with a mental health issue. But it's important to say that not all suicides are a cause of mental illness. Also, people can just get into desperate situations for various kinds of reasons, social, physical, where sort of just the prospect of living sort of is worse than the idea of being, not living anymore.
So you've led us into reasons why people commit suicide.
Yes.
So what are some of the typical reasons?
Well, as I see it, and the way I explain it often is that the pain of living just has become too great, too big. I think it's quite rare that people want to die. What people don't want, they don't want to suffer as much as they are doing. And then I think when people are experience difficulties, problems, then we're looking for a way out. That's so we are problem-solving creatures. We have a problem, we want to solve it, we want to like get out of this difficult situation. And that sort of, then there may be sort of various kind of options that you have, but some people when they have exhausted all the other options, the other way of getting out of the problem seemingly may be to like end life, commit suicide. And I think that's what often happens. One interesting thing that I sometimes share with people is that there's been done some research on people who have jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. So it's sort of, if you jump from that bridge, it's very high, you hit the water in high speed, you're almost certain of death. Not necessarily an impact, but sometimes you're so injured that you actually drown.
Yes.
What some people came up with the idea, well, let's, because the thing is not everyone dies. There are some people who have jumped from the bridge and survived, and some, it may sort of seem a bit morbid, but it's very interesting still, that some came up with the idea, well, let's ask people, what did you, the one who survived, what were you thinking on the way down?
Wow, okay.
That's, so, but just imagine, and I think it's very interesting. Yeah. So you have those 3-4 seconds it takes before you jump off the bridge till you hit the water. What were you thinking on the way down? And I think they were able to track down about 20 people who had jumped and survived. And as I remember it, all but one were thinking on the way down, I hope I survive.
Oh, really?
Yes.
There is still that hope for,
yes,
for life and a resolution for what they're facing.
Yes, and I think that shows that, to me, that tells a very strong story, that people, like the will to live is very strong. Like the will to escape suffering is also strong. That's in us, all of us. We don't want to suffer. And that, I think that's what drives people in most cases into committing suicide or attempting suicide, is that the pain just is so big that they would just want to escape it. But still, the will to live is very strong in like all of us.
Yes.
I think that's important in order to be empathetic with people who make a suicide attempt, or when people have completed a suicide attempt, to recognize that this is a person that was suffering a lot. And that we don't act out our own fears and frustration and pain towards the person who did whatever they did, whether they like completed the suicide or they survived. It's very important to be compassionate and empathetic, and go into a mode, if the person survives, how can we help you? How can we support you? How can we make your life different from what it is, so we can, so things can change.
Yeah. Now, often there's, particularly from Christians, if I can say this, there's a judgmental approach to suicides. They can often think that this person must have had a failed faith. Their connection with God mustn't have been what it should be. What would you say to Christians that think that?
Well, I think people who have that kind of thoughts and ideas, they maybe fail to recognize how painful life may be. When I have had patients, sometimes when I've sat and heard their stories, I have never said this to a patient, but sometimes I wondered, why have you not committed suicide?
Wow, okay.
Because the stories are so painful, what they've gone through, what they have suffered over time, over years, that I've sort of often sat down and with patients and said, I'm amazed that you're alive.
Wow.
What is it that have kept you alive? What have kept you going through all of this? So I think it's a failure to understand and appreciate how painful life can be, and also like being a Christian doesn't change that. Like Christians suffer pain. We suffer all the same things that other people do. we have perspective that there is a God, and hopefully have a God image, and understanding a concept of God where God is compassionate and caring and loving towards you. But unfortunately, many Christians also don't have that kind of God image. Oftentimes what we see, and we know this from psychology, is when people have struggled, if they have grown up with bad relational experiences, trauma, that kind of things, is that the image they have of other people, the expectations they have of other people, they can psychologically, often these are transferred to God also. So while we people may know on sort of a rational theological level that God is loving, God is kind, all these things, God is compassionate, on an emotional, psychological level, the experience may be very different from that.
Yeah.
Also, so it's very complex, and I think it's so important not to be judgmental.
Yeah.
That's cruel.
Yeah.
To be that way when people are struggling with these issues.
Yeah. Torben, you talked about the importance of responding. What should a pastor do for somebody in their congregation, somebody they know, or even a church member? What should they do if they encounter somebody they know, somebody they love, who has suicidal thoughts or even suicidal intentions?
Yeah. Well, I think when you're dealing with someone that you know are struggling, or it could be people who are withdrawing from the community, people who are changing in some way, then I think as a pastor, it should always be on your radar. Of course, what's going on? What are you struggling with, trying to help them on that, but also to keep in mind, at the back of the mind, also may this person be struggling with suicidal thoughts, plans, ideas of that. And when I was trained as a psychiatrist, to ask about these things, it can be a bit uncomfortable.
Well, taboo almost, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're really stepping in, into a very private space in a way, and you may feel that it's being intrusive to ask that kind of questions. But I found in my work that the best thing when you're going to talk about difficult things is to make it simple. Just ask, in a non-judgmental, compassionate way, coming from a position where you want to understand and you want to help, and just ask how about, are you having any thoughts about that you don't want to live anymore? Do you have thoughts of suicide? Are you struggling with any of these issues? That can be, I think, oftentimes a pastor should ask the question. If you are a family member, if you are a teacher, you don't need to be a health professional in order to ask that kind of question.
And what kind of symptoms would you be seeing to promote such a question? What kind of actions would be displayed?
Well, I think it's enough just someone that you pick up that this person is struggling.
But there's an aura that comes from them, or you pick up a vibe, or
well, you just you may know the circumstances, that they are in difficult life circumstances. You may know that they are having mental health issues. That kind of things in themselves are enough to sometimes warrant to probe into that if you are in a position. Don't just don't go casually asking those questions. You have to do it in a position, and you must have a commitment to support and follow up if you engage with these kind of questions. You must be you can't just. You're not just asking the kind of questions to relieve your own
curiosity
yeah. And feel that, well, I've done my job, now I can move on. So if you sense that someone is struggling, I think then it can be often appropriate to ask. Having that kind of thoughts is a very lonely thing, and people some may talk about it, and that's one of the myths. Often some people say that people who talk about suicide don't commit suicide. That's a myth. That's not true. And even some would say, because sometimes patients can sort of come across as a bit manipulative also, and it can be an aspect of manipulation also in expressing that, but they can still end up doing it. So the thing is, like, it's very difficult to assess risk, as like I was taught when I was like you cannot make a real statement about the chances that someone will commit suicide. Fortunately, suicidal thoughts are very common. I think there are lots of people at one point or another in their life who have had, maybe not sort of pursued the thought, but at least that the thought has come up, sort of, is this life really worth living? Right. Do I want to go on with
So is that a sign of mental unhealth that you're asking that question?
I wouldn't. I think I would say that question is normal. Okay. In a way. Right. I wouldn't say that's it's just, I think it's so common that we would have to diagnose too many people if we try to say that this is an expression of psychopathology. Right. I think it's an expression that life is hard. Yeah. And for most, like, it's very rare that people can go through life without facing any kind of hardships. So I think that's we just have to accept that that's something that happens. But fortunately, we could say that unfortunately it's very common that people have thoughts about suicide. But fortunately, it's very rare that people actually act on it. So that's someone, and that's when I'm working with patients also. Like most of them say that they've had that kind of thoughts. When I'm getting concerned is when this is a thought that is becoming quite dominant. Right. Okay. And especially when it's starting to become concrete. Okay. When they're spend quite a lot of time thinking about how they would do it, when they would do it, that kind of things. When people start having some kind of plans, or even have taken, especially if they started taking actions to prepare that they have, say, medication stored for the purpose of potentially committing suicide, like they have a rope for potentially hanging themselves, if they have firearms, various kinds of
access to some method.
Yes. Yeah. So that's really that's then it's serious.
So what's the appropriate response when you see these serious signals? What should a pastor, what should a church person do?
Well, what you should do, like always, is minimize the risk for someone doing something. Right. And again, like when you sense that this person is suicidal, then they should have professional help. Okay. And support. The challenge can be like people are not always willing to get help and get treatment, but at least try. If you realize, and if they're not willing, if that's not sort of easy to get them into treatment, then also like help them to get rid of whatever methods that they have and may have for doing something.
Do you do it with them? What's the best approach with that?
Well, you have to do whatever it takes.
Okay.
Sort of, if you sense this is serious, this is dangerous, then you have to do whatever it takes. And that means you may have to get them into treatment against their will. You may have to call the police to say if they have firearms, that kind of things. Now, I don't know the legal aspects of that everywhere, but at least do whatever it takes to get rid of the means that they
This is a life and death issue.
It is. Yeah. And this is not sort of this is the point where you cannot always just respect the autonomy of the individual. Like you have to save life. And
so when you're conversing with somebody, how should you talk with somebody? Do you need to be rather authoritative, or what's the best approach?
well, I think to take time, to make sure you have space and time to sit down and talk and try to really understand the situation and help the person so that the person can trust you. Also understand that you have enough time to develop that kind of context where the person realizes that this person actually wants to help me and this person is on my side. Of course, if it's an acute situation, then you may have to be authoritative and say, well, I'm doing this.
Right.
I'm taking away your guns. I'm taking your car keys, so you can't drive. Or I won't let you go. I'm going to stay with you until we even got help for you, or until things change. That's very important. Like someone who is suicidal should not be left alone. Never ever left alone.
Okay. That's a take-home point, isn't it?
Yes. So that is sort of don't leave that person until you feel safe that there is not a risk, significant risk now anymore, or someone else takes over.
Right. So what is, we talked about don't ever leave them. What are some of the other don'ts that we shouldn't do?
Well, again, like don't minimize their problems, don't criticize them. These things are very important. Like people don't have these kind of thoughts or are considering these kind of actions if it's not serious. So this is, as you said, it's a life and death matter for them. So I think that's so important that you really come in the position where you are compassionate, where you are understanding, and that you are supportive.
Yeah. Now, what if somebody confides in you and they want you to keep it as a secret? And there's enormous pressure on, because there is a stigma associated with suicide, even suicidal thoughts. And so there can be quite a deal of emotional, even blackmail, confidentiality, all sorts of things. So how do you appropriately respond in that situation?
Yeah, well, that's a tricky one, because like you have to balance trust and prevention of a catastrophic outcome. So if it's not an acute situation, then maybe you have to stay on the respect, the autonomy of the person, and as long as you are in a process, as long as sort of you feel that this is safe. But if it's an acute situation, if you sense that there is a real danger that something may happen, then you cannot sort of go into a position where you say, well, I won't tell anyone, I will keep this a secret. You have to take whatever actions is needed. What's often important is, if you do that, like, be transparent about it, as providing that is safe to do that. Sometimes you may have to go, in a way, sometimes you may have to go behind the back of the patient and risk your relationship, at least for the time being, in order to prevent a catastrophic outcome of it. So, but this is very difficult, and this is also where, like, if you are in the position to help someone, like, don't do that alone. Make sure you are counseling with someone who can give you advice also in this situation, to help you.
Because it does have an impact on the person that's
very much
administering.
It's a high stress situation for the helper, for the pastor, for the health professional to be in that kind of situation, because it's very uncomfortable to be in a situation where the other person that you're trying to help may potentially kill themselves.
Now, earlier we talked about people make attempts and they're not necessarily successful. How do we minister to somebody who has made an attempt and is perhaps trending that way again? What should we do?
Well, the thing is, like, people who have committed suicide and suicide attempt are at higher risk of doing it again. Sort of they cross this boundary once, they can do it again. So in these situations, again, I think all these, like, if someone has made a suicide attempt, they should get professional help and treatment. But like, as a pastor, you can play a significant role also in counseling with a person, supporting them, trying to understand what are the issues. Again, like, it's the exception that someone wants to die. Yeah. The thing is that people don't want to suffer all the pain. So, like, you have to get that and try to see what can you do and what can you help in order for the person to alleviate the pain, to relieve them of the pain that they are suffering.
Yeah. Now, do you have a good news story for us where somebody was potentially rescued? Can you, without breaching confidentiality, can you share a story where there was somebody that endured a difficulty and came through the other side?
Well, I had one patient once. Fortunately, I had not had many patients who have actually committed suicide. I had one patient that surprisingly committed, like out of nowhere, so completely unexpected, made a suicide attempt. Yeah. And then and we worked on this afterwards. Like, fortunately he survived, and we worked on this, worked through, talked about things, and that person sort of came out much better in the end. Like these kind of thoughts, they are like, they can be phases of life, or they can be transitory. That people are struggling with these issues. But I think it's like, what's so important when people struggle is that the net, that people come around them and support them. Yeah. And sort of, so they're not left alone, they're not shamed because of what they have done, but that love, care and compassion, they're surrounded with that.
Yeah. Now, if somebody's watching this program and they're alone, and they're thinking of, of their own suicide, what would you say to that person right now?
Well, it may go against anything they feel like, but they should connect with someone. Okay. And talk with someone. And like, a person, like, in the flesh is the best thing often, but like, many countries have these, like, suicide hotlines. Like, you usually can easily find that if you Google it, where you can call, having people who are trained professionals who can support and counsel on that. The thing is that the sad thing about suicide, that people often they commit suicide when they are at the bottom of the valley. Things like, if people persevere, if they continue, things will usually get better. Exactly. And get much better. Yeah. And people can recover completely. But when you are down in the pit, then maybe you don't see it. You're not able to believe it anymore. Yeah. But then listen to people around you who maybe they see hope, they see a future that you are not able to recognize in that moment. Yeah. And the thing is, when people become suicidal, it's like the whole thinking often becomes distorted. It becomes negative, self-condemning, and sort of you lose perspective. Yeah. Often, like, listen to other people. Other people will, in that situation, often be better equipped. Yes. To assess sort of why you should continue living than you yourself. Yeah.
Right. It might sound trite, but you look at the story of Judas. If only he had have hung on just another day or two. Yeah. There was a new dawn coming. Yeah. Jesus was resurrected. Just another day can make all the difference. Just to see that. Yes. That sunrise one more day.
Yes. Yeah. And like, there was hope for him.
Exactly.
Even then. So, but he gave up hope. It wasn't like the external things that made that situation so dark, but it was he himself that was not able to continue. I think it's a very tragic story. It's a painful story that we have, but again, sort of it shows that, like Peter.
Yeah.
Peter could have done the same thing.
Exactly.
Peter could have done the same thing in that situation, but he did not disconnect.
Yeah.
Rather, he reconnected with Jesus and
just hold out for the next day.
Yes.
One day at a time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Torben, thank you so much. Thank you for your insights. Thanks for the expertise that you've shared with us, and all the best to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today on Ministry in Motion, where our topic was, let's talk about suicide with Torben Bergland. These are the important take-home points from today's program. Globally, 800,000 people commit suicide and millions attempt suicide every year. The second point was, amongst young people, suicide is a leading cause of death. The third take-home point is that most people contemplating suicide don't really want to die, but to escape from their suffering. Our fourth point, always treat a suicidal person with empathy, compassion and care. Avoid being judgmental and critical. Our fifth take-home point is, when you sense somebody is struggling, talk to them. Ask them how they're doing and seek to understand them. Commit to follow-up and support. And sixth, in dealing with suicidal people, try to minimise the risk. If the situation is acute, do whatever it takes to keep them safe and never leave them alone. And our seventh point is, if you are suicidal, reach out to somebody and let them help you. Thanks so much for joining us on Ministry in Motion today. May God bless you and your ministry, and bye for now.